The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Living to the ripe old age of 100 isn't what it used to be. Tonight, we'll find out why it's more common than ever and what shapes the quality of life people have. Also, we'll sit down with the authors of a new book that argues there's a long way to go with cannabis legalization and the fight for racial justice. It's Thursday, June 22nd, and that's ahead on The Agenda. Canadian census data over the past few years shows that more of us are reaching and surpassing 100 years of age than ever before. With us now on why it matters to everyone, and whether it's as good as it sounds. In Ames, Iowa, Peter Martin, professor at Iowa State University, specializing in longevity and the co-founder of the International Centenarian Consortium. And here in our studio, Parminder Rana, Scientific Director of the McMaster Institute for Research on Aging and Lead Principal Investigator at the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging. And Angela Roberts, Assistant Professor at Western University and Principal Investigator for the Super Aging Research Initiative in Canada. Angela, Parminder, thank you so much for joining us in studio. Peter, thank you so much for joining us on the line. So before we get into our conversation, let's take a closer look at the data we just mentioned. So in 2016, the share of Canadian seniors surpassed the share of Canadian children. So you can look at the graph here. The red line, as it's trending upwards, represents seniors, and the blue line is those aged 0 to 14. Today, 1 in 5 Canadians is 65 or older. Our centenarian population increased by 16% between 2016 and 2021. Today, it sits around 10,000 to 11,000 people. But by 2061, as you can see in that photo right there, right at the tip, once the baby boomers reach old age, we could have nearly 100,000 centenarians. Centenarians were recently the second fastest growing population in Canada, right behind those aged 75 to 79. Peter, I'm going to come to you first. You've been studying centenarians around the world for nearly 35 years. In what countries are people living the longest?
Well, typically it is in Asian countries. Japan typically leads the pack of highest longevity and also the number of centenarians. European countries are often in that group too. I think with regard to life expectancy, Canada is in the top 22. So it's happening all over the world, just a little bit faster in Asian countries, particularly in Japan.
All right, you had mentioned Japan. Japan is often described, of course, as the best place to grow old. They have a philosophy that one should treasure life no matter what it looks like. What does that mean in practice?
Well, it means that a lot of time and effort is put into caregiving, of taking care of the oldest old, people in their 80s, 90s, and certainly hundreds, that no age is too old for Japan, that really life is treasured at every moment, from life to death, how long ever it might be.
All right, and you had mentioned as well European countries. I'm just curious, what are European countries and Japan doing right?
Well, as I indicated, caregiving is an important part. You have to invest in your health. You have to invest in medical care. And so there are basically two prongs. You have to do a lot of things yourself. European countries, Japan, are much more likely to be active, to be walking when compared at least to the United States. And of course, if things do go wrong, there is immediate support for you. And that's much more likely to happen in European countries and in Asian countries, certainly in Japan.
All right, I should mention that the top 3 people, the oldest people right now, are in Spain, Japan, and the U.S. And I'm coming to you, Angela, because you studied the very old in both U.S. and Canada. Briefly, what factors come into play when comparing how each country's society adds or subtracts from their ability to live to 100?
Well, for us, the Canadian cohort's really new for us. So we're just starting to understand perhaps some of the unique social factors that might affect aging and aging well in Canada. But when we look at the studies that we've done to date, largely with people in the US, some things that stand out to us are that these individuals typically experience less brain atrophy than do typically aging folks who are at their age, so 80 and over in our case, but whose cognitive abilities are at age normal. So keep in mind, our elite agers, our super agers, are people 80 and over whose cognitive abilities are like those in their 40s and 50s. And indeed, when we look at their brains also look like people in their 40s and 50s. So there's some unique social factors as well in terms of good sleep habits, reading, less television, high social engagement. And we're finding some of the same patterns in our Canadians as well. What's unique for us here is that we have more superagers who are married to one another. And we're really trying to understand that phenomenon. In our US studies, that's not the case. But over half of our cohort in Canada are actually husband and wife couples coming together for the study.
Very interesting. I do want to pick up on sort of the differences between U.S. and Canada. Walk me through some of those sort of social but environmental factors as well.
Sure.
I understand that Canada, we're looking in some areas, more rural areas. We're talking about possibly pollution playing a factor as well. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're really focused on in this next study, so we've had 10 years of research so far, adding our Canadian cohort in 2021, 2022. So we're really just starting that piece. But we're interested in looking at how can the Canadian Society aging group have experienced life differently from those in the US, particularly in terms of environmental toxins, stressors, movement and mobility, as Peter mentioned, is something that's really important. One of the things that's different is on the US side, most of our centers are located in urban areas, and our older adults there, while having experienced an agrarian society, the US industrialized at a much earlier time than we did in Canada in terms of large industrial centers. So for us, there's a real interest in thinking about how an agricultural life, a farm life, exposure to farm chemicals or lack thereof in terms of Canadian regulations as opposed to US regulations might affect these aging trajectories.
All right, Parminder, your Canadian longitudinal study on aging has been tracking 50,000 Canadians across 10 provinces. When it comes to biology versus environment, which is a big question that a lot of people want to know, give us a sense of what allows people to live to those elite ages.
Right. It's a difficult question to answer, what allows people to live to old ages. And I just wanted to qualify one thing, that I'm not a biologist. I'm an epidemiologist who works with a lot of biologists and other disciplines, people from other disciplines. And I think it's important to keep in mind when we talk about biology, biology doesn't work in isolation. Biology works in relation to our context and where we live and how we interact with other people. So biology definitely has a role, how we live. There are certain genetic predispositions we have that put us on a right track, but those could all be mired into problems if we don't live well, or if we are not happy, if we are socially isolated, or our environmental context is poor. So if we start to just focus on biology, we'll be missing piece of pie. Similarly, if we just focus on certain aspects of the day-to-day living and not look at the biology, we'll be missing that part of the picture as well.
Peter, I'm going to get your take. Same question to you. I think as the public, we probably want a clean line of, right. How much of a percent is it biology, how much of it is environment, what can we control? But give us a sense of what allows people to live to these elite ages.
Well, I could only second what we've just heard. Both biology and environment are important. We have targeted a number of genes that are associated with longevity, but we also need to recognize that genes need to be turned on. They need to be expressed. In the case of diseases, you don't have diseases in childhood that are the same that you find in later life. So these genes need to be expressed. They need to be turned on. And so there is a very important combination of looking at genes and environment all together. They really do, it makes a difference to look at both. And that's why most gerontologists work in interdisciplinary teams, so that you could understand all aspects of aging, and we learn from each other in important ways. And then I would second also that longevity and aging is a highly individualized process. There are many ways, many pathways up the mountain, and we're trying to find that secret of longevity. But if there was one, we probably would have found it. There's not just one. There's more than one aspect that connects to longevity, and that's what we're trying to find out. Are there any patterns that allow us to look at longevity and look at aging and aging well as really is the goal for gerontologists to work on.
And here I had a bunch of questions thinking I could get all the secrets from you and apply it to my life. But with that, Angela, you had mentioned something called the Canadian, you call it Super Agers. And we want to make a distinction here because your initiative, your research initiative, follows 500 unique Super Ager Canadians. And you do look across the U.S. as well.
That's right, yeah.
What is a Super Ager? Because it's different than just someone who is getting older. There's something obviously in the brain as well.
Yeah, for those of us who do this work, we think about elite cognitive aging, and you can describe elite aging as either by cognitive function, so how memory is going as they age, or by physical functioning. Our study really is looking at those elite cognitive aging folks. And so our study has 100-year-olds in it as well, but really the earliest age for us is 80. So people who are 80 and over, whose memory abilities look as good as or better than people in their 40s and 50s. And then, like my colleagues have talked about, we look at genetics and their brain structure and function and all of their behaviors to try to see what defines them differently. So we've defined ours based on chronological age, and 80 is kind of our entry point.
I do, with sort of what Peter and Parminder have said, I do want to ask this question because I know in your research you have so many anecdotal stories of what people have done and what their secret is. And I find, is there anything specific I should be eating? Because I understand there's actually a couple of people that you've been studying who have this is their go-to meal. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. So, the one thing that I will say that I think all of us will say in our areas of work, and our Super Agers are not any different, the best phone call is that first phone call. A recruiting call for this study takes us about 90 minutes because you will hear their life story straight out. And so I will say that they each are individual, but many of our folks seem to have meticulous eating habits. And we have one individual who's eaten 2 bran muffins in the morning and night every day since he was in his 20s. It's his recipe. He makes it. So that's his particular habit.
How old is he?
He is 94.
Oh, wow.
So we have other Super Agers who have other eating nuances, exercise nuances, meditation nuances, sleep habit nuances. So what they all can tell you, though, is how they think they got to this point. And that real underlying factor for all of our Super Agers is this sense of resilience, personal resilience formed in challenges, but also personal resilience that comes from having a strong support around them, social supports, family supports, societal supports.
All right, with that, I want to pull up a photo. I want to introduce you all to Jeanne Calment. Born in 1875, this French woman holds the record for being the oldest human being ever. As you can see in that photo, she's holding a little diploma there. She died in 1997 at the age of 122. I want to show another photo because this is quite interesting. This is the same. This is her celebrating her 117th birthday, and you can see she's enjoying a smoke and a little, I think, a little shot there. Peter, I can assume when people think, when you're 117, you probably are not a smoker because we know, many studies have shown that that's probably not the best thing to do to get there. I just want to get your reaction on something like that.
Well, if you ask what is the #1 health behavior that predicts whether people live a long life or not, then it is not smoking. A very small percentage of centenarians we have studied, less than 2%, are currently smokers. And even Jeanne Calment, whom I knew well at the time, only smoked occasionally, like for the camera, as it were. So, she was not a constant smoker, as is often portrayed. We like to see those images because it seems like you are defying all the odds by even smoking,
Right.
but it is not something that I would recommend. If there's something that I could recommend to people to live a longer and better life, and part why we have high life expectancy is because in many countries we have been able to control the level of smoking, and so it really is a clear outlier if you find somebody who regularly smokes at that age.
All right, I do want to follow up with you, Peter. It's been more than 25 years and no human being has surpassed her age. Meanwhile, here in Canada, life expectancy is 81 years and stayed pretty constant over the last decade. Does that mean that we've hit sort of a hard ceiling when it comes to the human lifespan?
Well, there's a difference between life expectancy and lifespan. Maximum lifespan, like you saw in Jean Calment, is probably, we've probably reached the ceiling because, as you indicated, we have people who make it to 116, 17, 18, but then nobody seems to go much beyond that. And Jean Calment was sort of an outlier there too. Life expectancy is really the average of what people can expect to live, and really is a measure at birth. So when we hear about 81, that means it relates to newborns this year or last year, or whenever the statistics is given. That has continued to increase, except for COVID. We've taken a few years back, certainly more in the United States than in other countries, but it will continue to slowly go up, but not as drastically as we had seen. If you consider that 120 years ago, if you were born in 1900, life expectancy was only 46 years. So we've made great strides in increasing life expectancy, sort of having obtained a second life, if you wish. But the gains now will be much smaller over time. So, half year, 2 years, and then probably on average that is going to reach a ceiling unless we find some of that magic genetic code that might help us make any changes here.
Well, I'm going to pick up on that. And Parminder, we talk about the genetic code. Could this change if we were able to genetically program ourselves differently?
Well, I'll pick up on something Peter mentioned, and I think he's absolutely correct in saying that we have reached our potential, and there are a lot of debate in the literature. Some people do projections and think we are going to live up to 140, 150, 160, but data doesn't show it. Partly because you need a lot of people in those age groups to predict what is going to happen in the future, and the evidence is not there. There's very few people who have made it. These are outliers we are talking about. Second thing, before I answer that question, I also wanted to make sure that we have a conversation. It's not all about longevity. It's also about health span, how we live. As long as we live, we want to live in as healthy as possible. I think unless we find some magical biological nugget that changes the fundamental biology of aging, we are going to struggle to figure out a way to extend life. And there's work happening. It might happen. You never know with science what can happen. But so far, that has been a difficult challenge to achieve. Even the mechanisms of aging, biological mechanisms, there's not a single mechanism that allows you to age. There are multiple things that are happening. And I think the more and more in the mainstream geriatrics and gerontology focuses on how do we increase the health span.
All right. Angela, I'm going to come to you. You've been studying a special centenarian living in Chicago. What makes her so unique?
What makes her so unique is that she still has this vibrancy in health, right? And so it's not that she's just 100. Edith is not just 108, but Edith is really the poster representation of what it means to age well. She still cooks every day. She is a direct descendant of enslaved peoples who came to the northern U.S. on the Underground Railroad, and she celebrates life and shares that history. And I think this is one of the things that we all draw such joy from in our work. And the world benefits from our ability to understand the biology and the environmental environmental contributions in terms of helping for health span and longevity span. But the other important societal contribution of these elite agers, super agers, is that they help us understand our history. They capture for us a living time capsule that we can actually continue to learn from and reduce the stigma of aging, and Edith is doing that. So she's on television frequently, she advocates for others, she just had a building at a university named on her behalf, not just because she is older, not just because she's lived in this healthy way, but because she has broken barriers her entire life in the area of race and equity. So I think these are the fantastic things that these groups and these individuals offer to us, and studying them is important for a variety of reasons, most importantly because they hold our history in hand.
All right. Peter, I do want to ask you a question, and whether or not there is a connection here. Do poor people living in poor living conditions always live shorter lives than those who are more fortunate?
Well, probably on average. But again, there's a difference between looking at the population and their average resources that they have and that may allow them to live a long life. But there are certainly exceptions. We have interviewed centenarians in rural Georgia and rural Iowa, and some of them in the South had no refrigeration and lived under very poor conditions. And still, it's what I think what Angela talked earlier about. It's that resiliency. It's being able to make do with what you have that is so important. And so another example here of there's not one pattern. Certainly, it helps to have resources. It helps to have to live in better circumstances, but that sometimes also comes with more stress. And so, as Angela said, just enjoying life where you are and feeling rooted in your community counts for a lot, no matter what that community looks like.
All right. Another factor that I do want to ask you, Peter, is, and we see this here in Canada and other countries, is life expectancy between the gender line. Women typically live longer than men. Why?
Well, they take better care of themselves. When I give public presentations, I often, and I have some men in their 60s, 70s, or 80s who want to know about longevity, I do tell them, behave more like women, and you have a better chance to make it to 100. They're more likely to seek help, to seek medical care. Men are still sort of thinking they can work it out themselves. Women have better social support. They talk about their problems. So there's an emotional, psychological component to it, too. So there's a lot that men can learn from women in terms of not only living longer, but as Parminder said, also to have a higher quality of life and increasing health span just by taking better care of yourself.
Parminder, the Canadian healthcare system is under a lot of stress. Is it ready to handle this unprecedented increase in seniors? We've seen the projections early off the top. Is it ready?
Well, I think in order to answer that question, you have to look at the context within which our healthcare system was designed. The current universal healthcare system was designed in the early 60s. Our average age of the population was 28 or 29. Our average age is 42, 43 right now. And so the acute care sector didn't have as much burden when the population was younger. If we are going to meet the demands of whether it's a healthcare demands or they are social care demands, we just can't design healthcare around hospitals. We have to move that into our communities, have community structures available, because 70 to 80% of the older people live quite functionally in their own communities, in their own homes. Then there is 20% who have some issues, but then there is 7 to 8% who have complex needs. So we have to map our care system in relation to the needs of the population. And I think governments have missed that opportunity. They are now, pandemic has shown a light on that the people are thinking about it. But still, we have long ways to go. Unless we have a good, strong community care system, our healthcare system is not going to be able to sustain itself. Because on average, some of the data that has been generated in Ontario, if you have to put an older person in a hospital for a day, it costs $1,500. In the community, it costs $250 to provide a good service, and people living in their own home, interacting with their own communities, and having the social life that they should have. And I think that's the challenge. And systems are big juggernauts. It's hard to shift them. And governments are struggling how to make that happen. And there are interests in there, nursing interests, physician interests, other interests that come into play. I think it is a complex issue. It is a collective effort that is going to be needed. I just wanted to pick up on something, if you allow me, that Peter had said. I think if we look at around the world, the countries that have high life expectancies are the countries that have done very well socioeconomically, right? It is the social determinants of health have actually led us to reach these exceptional life expectancies. It is an amazing, remarkable achievement of the modern public health system, right? That sanitation, better food, discovery of penicillin, removal of infectious diseases, that has allowed us. And as Peter mentioned, on average, social determinants of health, including socioeconomic disadvantage, does put you at a disadvantage. Some people thrive in all sorts of circumstances, but we can't all be looking to solutions that are biological. There are social solutions that we have to think to sort out some of these challenges.
All right, Angela, I'll get you to pick up on that as well. Like, what does Canadian society need to do to change?
I think from our perspective, I pick up and agree with what Peter and Parminder have said, and I want to pick up on one item, the importance of maintaining social communities. I think one of the things that happens, and we know this as people age, is increased social isolation, not necessarily a sense of intrinsic loneliness, although that can come with it, but really isolating our older adults from one another and from a community that helps to maintain vibrancy in aging. And the infrastructure that we build has to account for that, to allow meaningful connections, not just with their peers, but intergenerational programming, bringing children and young people together with older adults. That is how we keep society vibrant, but it's also how we help increase quality of life for older adults.
All right, Peter, I want to ask you a question, and I'm going to ask this question with knowing full well that I might not make friends with this, and my mom might not like this question as well. But if there's one cohort that always makes it to the voting booth, it's the elderly. Politicians know this. They entice them with tax breaks. Would it be beneficial if we instead made seniors pay more into the system as their needs increase and our tax base and fertility rates shrink?
Well, it is a controversial issue, obviously. I think about it more as a lifespan contribution you need to make. You cannot wait until your 60s and 70s to pay more into a system. You really have to think about it much earlier. In my classes with undergraduate students, I have them estimate how long they're going to live, then I give them the projections, and there's a big gap. Young adults don't expect to live into their 90s, and most of them will, or even older. And so you have to make a contribution early and throughout life. And then if we all do this, if we all have a commitment to pay up in our 20s, 30s, all the way into our 80s and 90s, certainly older adults, very old adults, should also make their contribution to the extent that they can. But you cannot wait until very, very late life to start doing that.
All right, Parminder, much of the work that all of you guys do contains a real element of mystery. What's one mystery of aging that you hope the human race can unlock in the next decade?
Ageism.
Yeah.
I would say if somehow our societies figure out not to be ageist, we will make massive gains in how people age in our communities. And this was highlighted during the pandemic. With right intentions, people were, in Canada, were sort of labeling older people as vulnerable, decrepit. They were in long-term care. They're all going to die. And unless we change our attitude, we can do every other miracle related to the science can provide if the societal impression of what it means to be aged. And Peter's opening comments about Japan, they're valued. And I think that's what we need to think. If we don't do that, there will be institutional barriers, there will be community barriers, there will be individualistic barriers to making things happen in a positive fashion. So I would go with ageism.
Angela, same question to you.
I think that's incredibly important, and I won't minimize that. But I do think the biology here is important. So one of the reasons we started the Super Aging Research Initiative was to better understand what's going wrong in conditions like dementia and Parkinson's disease. So I think the mystery is understanding not just risk, but what might be protective factors in these older adults who are aging in such a robust way cognitively, so that we can actually help people who might be on the other end of the cognitive aging spectrum who are experiencing these conditions.
All right. My last question to you, we have about a minute left, and I'm going to start with Peter. We're going to go down the line. Do you want to live to 100? Why or why not?
I would not mind living to 100 if I can stay healthy physically and cognitively and socially.
All right. Parminder.
I would give the same answer. If I'm healthy, I want to live as long as possible because there's so much to do in this world, and I like to be part of that. But having a health and engaging with community, contributing to the community, and this is related to earlier comment or question you had asked, it's not all about money, right? Older people contribute to their communities till they die, and I think we have to value that, and as long as I can provide that value, I want to live as long as possible.
All right, Angela, you get the last word.
I come from a family of super aging women, and so my answer is going to be yes, but with the same thing, in a world where we don't have stigma in aging, and I can continue to contribute as long as I can do that, I'm happy to be here.
All right, Peter, Parminder, Angela, thank you so much. Very thoughtful and great conversation. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Since cannabis was legalized in Canada almost 5 years ago, fortunes have been made and the entire landscape of buying and selling pot has transformed. What that leaves unsaid, however, is recognition that communities disproportionately hurt before that have often not been the same people who have benefited after. Waiting to Inhale, Cannabis Legalization and the Fight for Racial Justice is a new book that lays it all out. With us to explain, the two co-authors, in New York, New York, Tahira Rahmatullah, who is a partner in Highlands Venture Partners and CEO of the wellness and fitness company Commons. And here in our studio, Akwasi Owusu-Bempah, professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto, Race Equity Lead, Center on Drug Policy Evaluation. Welcome to you in studio. And Tahira, thank you so much for joining us on the line. Akwasi, I'm going to start with you. How did you get interested in cannabis as a policy issue?
So I'm a criminologist and someone who studies inequality in our criminal justice system. And it's almost impossible to do that without examining the impact that our drug laws have had on fostering and drug law enforcement on fostering the overrepresentation we see of Black, Indigenous, Latino people, not only in our correctional facilities, but kind of throughout the criminal justice system. And cannabis is one of the most commonly used illicit substances where it's illegal and legal drugs. And so I couldn't do my work on inequality in the justice system without looking at cannabis.
All right. Tahira, I know there's a family connection in terms of really getting the start. Explain that to me and how you got started with cannabis policy.
Yeah, so it started really with my grandfather in 2013. He was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. And as what happens often with people who are you have someone in their life who's suffering, we want to find something that will help them. And so it was actually my mother, of all people, who started doing a lot of research and kept coming across cannabis. And that really sparked an interest for me, just trying to understand more. It was 2013. They lived in Ohio. There wasn't anything available for them at that time on the legal market. And then just quickly from there, I started learning a lot more about what was happening, the history from what I knew as a child of the 80s, 1980s, Nancy Reagan, Just Say No, and realizing that a lot of that was inaccurate from what really happened during that period in the war on drugs. And what started as a research project for me became much more of a career.
All right, let's get an idea of the landscape. Cannabis has been legal in Canada for nearly 5 years, of course, October 2018. Has it been a success or failure in your eyes?
Overall, I think the fact that we got legalization to happen has been a great success. Now, with major caveats, and for me, the largest one being the inequity that still exists within our legal landscape. Our previous laws were enforced in a very inequitable manner, and as I've discussed before on the show, again, Black and Indigenous people much more likely to be arrested and feel the burden of prohibition, but they've largely been left out of the legal landscape as beneficiaries, either in industry or in other ways that legalization could have benefited them, through, for example, the redistribution of tax revenues back into those communities most harmed. So, on the whole, I'm extremely happy that we have legalization. It's an imperfect model for a number of different reasons. And of course, the business landscape at the moment is challenging. We still have, other policy areas related to cannabis that we need to work out. But by and large, as the first kind of large country to do this, I think it's been overall successful.
All right. So here, a little bit different, of course, when we look at the U.S., a bit fragmented in terms of where it is legal. Give us a picture for us viewers here north of the border. Where are things with legalization in the U.S.?
Although we do not have federal legalization like Canada, we do have 40 states that have medically legal cannabis. We have 23 states plus DC that have adult use. So the momentum is there. What we really need is federal policy in order to allow for companies to operate in a more efficient manner, for banking to be more flexible for all of the different businesses. So still elements of it that make it really challenging, despite the fact that there's no federal legalization, but the fact that we have almost the whole country moving in that direction is a positive sign for us.
All right. I want to read a passage from both of your books. The war on drugs, even as it burrowed deep into our cultural fabric, is nothing more than linguistic sleight of hand. Drugs are an excuse for hostilities, but the real target is the class of North American society born under siege. Make no mistake, there is a war, but it is ridiculously one-sided. This war is waged on those who live in our most marginalized inner-city neighborhoods, transformed into urban battlefields by those who cloak themselves in morality while terrorizing and oppressing the racial minorities among us. Tara, I'm going to pick that up with you. How has the war on drugs terrorized and oppressed racial minorities?
The way that we've really examined it, and combining my experience in the business side and Akwasi's research and academic experience, understanding so much of the history of this, we've seen the war on drugs and drug law enforcement largely as a way to issues social control. So a way to really focus on different communities that perhaps want to, governments want to fall in line, or they want to have different things happen. And you can see this pattern throughout the course of time, both in the US and Canada. And so when we look at drug prohibition more broadly, it all kind of leads back to racial roots. And that's something that we really wanted to point out and really illuminate by writing this book, to show where it had come from and where we think that adjustments need to continue to be made in order for it to be more effective.
Akwasi, when we associate the war on drugs, of course, we think President Nixon, we think, this is the 70s, and obviously the US. Mm-hmm. What about in Canada?
Yeah, we've had a long history of racialized drug prohibition in this country. I think, many viewers would be surprised to know that our first drug laws were actually, of course, alcohol prohibition, right, which applied only to our Indigenous population. So, we really started off there. The Opium Act of 1908 was developed as a direct response to the perceived economic threat that the Chinese population who'd been recruited to build the railroad was posing to white laborers on the West Coast following the completion of that railroad. And, the passage of subsequent drug laws, including cannabis in the late 1920s as well, highly racialized, at least in some popular discussions. Emily Murphy, who we often celebrate as a notable Canadian, wrote extensively about the supposed threat that racialized immigrants pose to white people, by and large through their introduction of drugs and drug use to those populations. So that's, really our early history. And then unfortunately, we don't have great disaggregated criminal justice data by race in Canada, unlike the United States. So it's been more challenging to trace the racial disparities in enforcement. But where they do exist, again, they demonstrate very clearly Black and Indigenous people, first with the announcement or pronouncement of a war on drugs in Canada as well in the 1980s, disproportionately leading to the increased incarceration of Black and Indigenous people. And in the lead up to cannabis legalization, we were able to obtain cannabis arrest data from major police agencies across the country that showed quite literally from Vancouver through to Halifax and the cities we were able to get that data for, that Black and Indigenous people were greatly overrepresented in those possession arrests, even though research I've been involved with colleagues at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health demonstrate that, as in the United States, drug use patterns are relatively similar across different racial groups. So this is a matter of certain aspects, social circumstances and presence on the street, et cetera, but undoubtedly racially disparate enforcement.
Tahira, I want to pick up on that idea of data and research, because unfortunately, there was a lot of it lacking in the early days of cannabis. There was, connections with cannabis to heroin as a Schedule I drug in the U.S. Talk to me a little bit about, did authorities ignore studies that spoke honestly about the effects of cannabis? And if you can give us some examples as well.
Absolutely, and this really happened during the Nixon administration, where there were several studies that were done, a range of studies that were done that were commissioned to be done, and actually only one of them showed that there were negative impacts from cannabis itself on populations, and that was the study that was utilized as a tool to then enact policy around drug enforcement. And so, it's been selective over historical times, and we've seen decently in the past that certain populations are then affiliated with certain kinds of drugs. We have Chinese with opium, we have Black populations with heroin, we have Mexicans with cannabis. And so as you look at how these populations have been joined to certain substances, this has really been beneficial to focus on data that could potentially support that, as opposed to wider data that does not. And what we're seeing now is that studies are showing that something like cannabis is as addictive as something like sugar or even something like nicotine, but certainly not more harmful to be a Schedule I narcotic like heroin. And so these are the things that are happening now over time, that as it's been more available to utilize, not only at the state level, but the federal level, to be allowed to actually study cannabis. And countries like Israel have led on that side for quite some time. So utilizing that information now, we have so many more advocates who are pushing to say, okay, this is actually the information that we have, as opposed to what's been really focused on in the past.
All right, I will admit, you guys do a great job of blending in not only the facts and the numbers and the data, but also putting a human element to the face of cannabis here. Walk me through the idea of legalization of cannabis. How did the idea first emerge? Who was sort of pushing for that?
Well, I think that depends on exactly where you look on this side of the border or elsewhere. There's long been support for cannabis legalization, both in Canada and the United States, going back to at least the 60s and certainly the 70s. And, with respect to the commissions and the studies, I think we'd be remiss not to mention the Ledane Commission here that tabled reports, in the early 1970s, again, examining the potential harms or oftentimes lack thereof of cannabis to personal and public health, and advocating for suggesting legalization, which ultimately was shelved. And so there have been a variety of different interest groups who have largely championed the cause for legalization. There have been a libertarian group that feel that the government shouldn't be telling people what they can do with their own bodies. I think there are people that recognize, again, the harms of prohibition. Certainly myself and other criminologists and social scientists, public health scholars would suggest that drug criminalization, drug prohibition itself, is much more harmful than the substances that are often controlled, especially when you look at a societal level and how they block people from getting access to the type of treatment they may need, if they need it, to deal with the addictions issues that they have.
All right, Tahira, who are some of the early pioneers of cannabis reform?
Well, in the early days in the U.S. in particular, I think one group that we really failed to recognize are gay activists who were responding to the AIDS and HIV crisis of the 1980s. And that group really brought back this notion that cannabis was medicine, brought that back into the political discourse, because really, the war on drugs started in 1971. And so that really was the early stage for the U.S. to start moving in that direction. And that was California was the first state to legalize from a medical perspective in 1996. And then that really started the wave of other states to start looking at it from a medical perspective. And you also had states like Oregon who started to look at it from the other side, which was how do we kind of, instead of the legalization element, let's focus on decriminalization. So there were policies like that started to shift across the country. And obviously now we're in a very different state than we were then. But, thinking about those activists in the early days who were responding to very specific things that were happening that other groups were not paying enough attention to, or there weren't resources for. Today, it's a whole range of bodies who are focused on it, anything from business to when we think of economic empowerment, social equity groups, and also people like Kwasi myself who look at it from the racial justice lens as well, on who has the ability to engage in this business now that it has become something that is legalized in a lot of different forms. But a lot of people are still being left on the sidelines because of that, because of the past. And then, beyond that, it's always a political initiative, no matter where you look at it, and it's become quite a bipartisan issue because on one side, it's health, it's wellness, it's letting people have choice, and then on the other side, it's about taxes and revenue. Right. So you can pretty much make a case for anybody on any side of the table to support cannabis and other drug policy initiatives.
All right, let's talk the human toll. I want to read another passage from your book. This time, you are quoting Bruce Western, the co-director of the Justice Lab at New York Columbia University, and his colleague, Becky Pettit. It reads, "Clear majorities of the young men in poor communities are going to prison and returning home less employable and more detached from their families. In this situation, the institutions charged with public safety have become vitally implicated in the unemployment and the fragile family structure characteristic of high crime communities. For poorly educated young men in highly incarcerated communities, a prison record now carries little stigma. Incentives to commit to the labor market and family life have been seriously weakened." Kwasi, there are numerous examples in the book of Black men and women who were convicted and incarcerated for selling marijuana. Is there one story that sticks out to you?
Oh, that's a very good question, and one that we get a lot. And, Michael Thompson's an individual who we profile in the book, and he now has a project, the Michael Thompson Clemency Project. He was ultimately convicted of possessing a very small quantity of cannabis, one that, especially in the Canadian context, but even there in the US where he was ultimately convicted, was a small possession count. Now, he had a previous record, but he was initially sentenced to 42 to 60 years for the subsequent cannabis offense, and he spent decades in jail as a result of this offense. And his story, an individual who was struggling to make ends meet in many ways in the already marginalized community that he lived in, to be sent to jail, to prison, for such an extended period of time, especially as legalization was taking hold in the United States. I think there were several stories that we profile in the book, and this is something that we'd hear often, is that the individuals, again, often coming from marginalized neighborhoods, who were arrested and ultimately convicted, and some of whom were imprisoned for possessing or even trafficking in quantities of cannabis that would be, just snickered at by people operating in the legal cannabis industry now. To have them still behind bars while this legal industry was operating in the jurisdiction in which they were incarcerated, myself and the individuals affected found, just so highly offensive. And so Michael Thompson, and again, he's doing great work now through his Clemency Project to bring awareness to the toll of the war on drugs and the need really for repair. But the stories were numerous.
All right, Tara, I want to get your take as well. Was there anyone else that stuck out that was quite an important story that you guys were like, this is a story we need to share?
Yeah, another one that we do share is about Evelyn LaChapelle. She was a young mother in California, and she ended up spending 87 months in prison after a 2013 arrest for what is viewed as a small role in a cannabis distribution operation. She never touched the cannabis herself, never actually distributed it. She actually had a partner who was using her bank account. And so for that, she ended up getting 87 months. She was in solitary confinement. She had no previous record, and she ended up being released in 2018, but was and has now become a social justice advocate. She has her own business in the cannabis space, but it's impacted her in a way that, we hear the story all the time, is that this record follows you around. You aren't able to get the resources that you need. You're not able to get jobs. And she is somebody who was actually college educated. And so you would think that she could come out and have so many more opportunities, but that's really not the case. And so really just looking at, the different socioeconomic people who came in from different areas, different backgrounds, and the impact that it's had on them is so devastating that it is really hard to wrap your mind around how we've allowed that to continue to happen. And it still continues to happen today. I mean, we even have an example of someone who was sentenced to life in prison for selling the equivalent of $20 worth of cannabis. And that just was retried, and he was resentenced to not life in prison, but 45 years. So still, it's not that much better. And we're seeing these stories continue to play out.
I'm just curious, Kwasi, when we look at sort of the the terms and the sentences we're hearing. When we hear 87 months, we're hearing numerous years. How can we compare that to the laws here in Canada? We're not seeing those type of extreme punishments.
Certainly not in recent times. You know, in the 1970s, you could get a prison sentence for possessing a small quantity of cannabis. More recently, our laws and the enforcement got, you know, somewhat more lax. To give viewers a sense, though, there were about 50,000 cannabis simple possession arrests a year in the 2 decades leading up to legalization. Now, many of those cases, yes, would have been, you know, filtered out of the system before someone was even convicted. Very few people would ultimately have been incarcerated for a possession offense. But in the book, and you know, we've said this many times, we see cannabis as a gateway drug. Not a gateway to harder drug use, but a gateway into the criminal justice system for our most marginalized populations. So in my work, you know, I'm working on a file on a case at the moment, and there's an individual who's currently serving a life sentence for a very serious offense. But when you look back through his life history and his record, his first conviction was a simple cannabis possession conviction. Then an individual, as many others do, end up, you know, perhaps getting a period of probation, but then there are conditions attached to that probation, which they may not be able to abide by, and so they might get a failure to comply with those conditions. Or again, because an individual has a criminal record, it's harder to complete school, to get a job, to essentially operate normally in our society, and so that can start a cycle of incarceration. So yes, our laws have been less harsh in the Canadian context, but I don't want to diminish the impact that cannabis criminalization has had. And we talk about it's not just on these individuals, right? Their families are affected because, you know, they have to pay legal costs, and those individuals can contribute less to their families, but entire communities. When you look at the arrest data that we got, cannabis enforcement is concentrated again in our more marginalized neighborhoods, and that depletes social capital from those neighborhoods. So we spent, and we have spent, billions of dollars policing a war on drugs in Canada and through the justice system. You know, that's billions of dollars that have gone to police, to courts and corrections to wage a war that is clearly not being won, while at the same time taking money away from schools, from hospitals and community centers in those very neighborhoods, which would help them be healthy and vibrant neighborhoods.
All right, I want to ask you a follow-up to that. You give some policy recommendations in the book, including expunging the records of people convicted of cannabis offense, of course, simple possession as well. In your book, you kind of lay it out in a sort of in a comical way because of sort of the challenges that one would have to go through. And not only here in Canada, when we have paper records, it's kind of all muddled. What would that entail to kind of go through that process?
Yeah, in the Canadian context, and thankfully some things have changed since we wrote the book. You know, our government's now passed laws that would have simple possession or convictions records for all drugs essentially sealed after a period of time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who has a record is going to benefit from that because of the way in which records, as you've kind of noted, were stored and where ancillary records may exist. But you know, we initially had this system where people had to apply and go through an 8 or 12-step process depending on who you were. It was supposed to be free, but you had to pay to get your fingerprints, et cetera. And it was a largely arduous process. The government estimated 10,000 people would be eligible for its program. There were numbers as high as 500,000. The last time I got my hands on the numbers, about 550 people had successfully received a record suspension. So that record, that system was, you know, an abject failure as it had been described by others.
All right, so here, Kwasi had mentioned it as well, redistributing the revenue from legal sales into the communities most harmed. Tell me what that would look like, expand on that idea, and why hasn't that been something that has necessarily been picked up, you know, on both sides?
Well, one way that we look at it is the savings that could exist if we stopped enforcing the laws in a certain way and really channeled those resources in a different way. You know, so just think of the savings alone that you could have if you weren't focused on putting people in jail, you know, which we estimate is between $70,000 and $75,000 per person just to get them through and process them and put them in jail. And so if you think of just that number alone and multiply that by however many, those savings could be reallocated in a way to the community, to hospitals, to schools, to other public resources. Beyond that, when we look at cannabis legalization, what has happened more in the U.S. is that there are carve-outs that are starting to happen in order to, from tax revenue, in order to then apply towards social equity applicants or those who have been harmed by the war on drugs or marginalized in some way. We haven't really seen that play out yet. It's still quite early to be able to see the results of that. But that is another way too that the benefits of cannabis legalization to then factor back into communities. One piece of that, though, is that why is cannabis legalization the only resource to actually help these communities to actually, when a whole range of policies, not just cannabis, making that illegal, but a whole range of other things have factored into it. So that kind of idea around reparations. And that's why we think that the savings element is so important, because if you stop enforcing these ridiculous, draconian policies that we've had for so long, you can really channel those resources in a much more broad way to people don't have to necessarily be affiliated or have a family member who was impacted by cannabis. It's more broadly what's happened, as Akwasi was saying, to these communities that's really led to people being in a cycle of poverty. And we see that all over the country. We see that in the US, we see that in Canada. And that's really a way that we think that, communities can really benefit largely by legalization, is to think of those two-pronged elements as well.
And just following up on that piece, there are some great models that we profile in the book. Tahira's in New York, where legalization hasn't necessarily rolled out in the way that it was anticipated. But when you look at
Illinois, give us 2 years.
When you look at Illinois, for example, they'd set up a fund that takes a proportion of the tax revenues generated from legal sales to go directly back into the communities most harmed, right? And that's something that was certainly missing from the Canadian context. When we go back to our legalization, there was no conversation around social justice being had at all. It was really around public health, public safety, and protecting youth. And so there's a huge amount of space in Canada to kind of model some of the initiatives that we're seeing south of the border, both with respect to inclusion in industry, but certainly with respect to the redistribution of the revenues, as Tahira has rightly said, that are saved from law enforcement and criminal justice, as well as pulling from the billions of dollars that are being made from legal cannabis.
I have about 30 seconds left, Akwasi. I do want to ask you one question. I imagine when you are, talking about the cannabis industry at various conferences, you're probably looking around the room. You are probably one of a few people of color in that room, in that space. And I imagine that's how sort of you guys have connected in taking space in this industry. And I do ask, how do you make the cannabis industry more inclusive? Because there are people who are doing that right now. How do you change that from looking at it through a criminalization side of it to being active participants?
It's a great question. As you've said, we're about 5 years out from legalization here. Our 3-year review of the Cannabis Act is currently underway. And I think one of the clearest things that the Canadian government could do is expand the purpose of the Cannabis Act to include social responsibility, and I would add social justice. And the social responsibility aspect comes from the legislation that basically enables the Ontario Cannabis Store. And that would allow for a range of initiatives, both government directed as well as from industry. Government can incentivize the diversification of industry through, waiving regulatory fees for companies that report their diversity statistics, for example, by incentivizing in other ways companies to diversify. I wouldn't necessarily recommend people running in now because of the state of our industry, but then also incentivizing industry to do the same thing as well, recognizing that having a diverse board of directors, C-suite, and workforce is essentially good for business. Diverse companies outperform their non-diverse peers. And so, and I think that, the market will also recognize that. My research has shown that there are certain groups that don't want to engage with legal cannabis because they don't see it as fair, they don't see it as just, and they may be more likely to do so if they see cannabis companies and brands that reflect themselves and their interests.
All right, we are going to have to leave it there. Tahira, Akwasi, thank you so much. Very important story. Really appreciate you coming on the program tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That is the agenda for Thursday, June 22nd, 2023. Tomorrow, Steve talks to Liberal leadership candidate Ted Hsu about whether a nice guy with a PhD in physics has the leverage to win the top job. I'm Jay Jaganathan. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.